Good morning, everyone. I hope you enjoyed your day, stayed for the fun last night, got a lot out of it, and came back energized and ready to spend the rest of the day with us. We've got an enormous, really critical conversations happening today that, to me, are on the front of the tipping points in thinking about our future and our critical infrastructure. And so I'm really excited about the plenary panel that's going to come this morning. And so I just want to thank you all, thank our sponsors, welcome you all today. And first, we're gonna start with some creative thinking. I don't know if any of you have heard from Chancellor Xero Skidmore before, but he's really moving. He's a poet, an educator, and an organizer from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. He's been ranked twice among the top 5 slam poets in the United States at the individual World Poetry Slam Festival, and he's ranked 3rd in 2010 and 1st in 2013. You can find his work published in the anthology Spoken Word Revolution. And in the spring of, he's also has another publication. He teaches poetry to teens in Baton Rouge and its surrounding areas through Forward Arts, his organization. And so we're really excited to have him. He has worked with us in taking community input in some of our coastal parishes before, and using community's words to help tell a narrative and a story and through poetry. And so I'm very grateful to my friend Xero, and let's welcome him to share his words with us.
Good morning, everybody. As it stands, we are still referring to our state as the sportsman's paradise. We are still standing. We are standing still. As it stands, there is a mom living in East Baton Rouge who is still recovering from the flood of 2016. There was the damage, there was the loss of wages, the cost of repairs, there was the payment, there was the unfinished repairs, there was the second contractor, there was the depression, the drinking, there was the rehab. There is still rehab. As it stands, there is a shrimper still trying to make a living after Hurricane Ida destroyed his boat. There was the damage, there was the loss of wages, then there was the cost of repairs. There was the anxiety around the constant cycle of getting knocked down and getting back up, rising fuel prices, declining shrimp prices. There was the anxiety about the next hurricane. There is still the anxiety. As it stands, there is a gifted Louisiana poet who hates Louisiana summers. The length of the Louisiana summers is about 6 months, the same as hurricane season. This poet, who will remain nameless, is slightly overweight and always runs a little hot to begin with, but finds it more and more expensive to keep his house cool. He knows that heat is the biggest weather-related killer in the US, and while he may not be suffering through the stages of hyperthermia, he can still see his city, his state, experiencing the cramps, exhaustion, and strokes, both metaphorically and in reality. As it stands, our actions are locking our children in sweltering parked cars without any cracked windows. The fact that we've chosen to sit in the car with them does not make their suffering any less cruel. As it stands, we are referring to our state as the sportsman's paradise. A sportsman is a competitor, a player, someone focused on winning, and hopefully someone who practices good sportsmanship, which means they pursue this goal of winning in a way that is both honorable and respectful. The way they move is synonymous with what they stand for. It is possible to hold firm to who you are while entertaining what more you can become. That's the challenge, the sport of it. It's how we embrace the beauty and the brutality of our history while evolving to ensure a better future. I have never seen crawfish boiled with solar energy or biodiesel, but I'm guessing if it's seasoned right, ain't nobody gonna leave the crawfish boil hungry. And just because I haven't seen it doesn't mean it doesn't already exist, or the people using it aren't real Louisianians or real Americans. As it stands, we humans have been in a constant state of evolution and migration. But looking at it is like watching the hour hand on a clock and not seeing motion. The hour hand is moving much faster than you think. It's time for us to get up and get going, more like a minute hand, in the opposite direction of global warming, extreme weather, poverty, and trauma. Those things are not what we stand for. We know what we stand for, but now is not the time to stand still. It never was. Thank you.
He just inspires me. I had chills all over as he was delivering his poem. Thank you so much, Xero. Before we introduce our next panel, I want to make sure you all are aware of who all's behind this. And where is Macy and Lauren? Where are Macy and Lauren? There's Lauren. So this summit would not be possible without the remarkable skills and attention to detail of Macy, who's been leading this, and Lauren, who is the backbone of all of our operations. And so thank you, Macy, Lauren, and the entire CPEX team for putting on this summit. All of the CPEXers have a little silver name tag, and so if you want to thank them, they would love to hear that, I'm sure. Okay, so I'm really excited about this next discussion. I think for the planning community, understanding the future of our energy grid, how power is received in our homes, what those energy sources are, and how we can share in the energy future and have transformational change around renewables, clean energy, reducing our carbon emissions, but also new ways to think about our grid so that there's mutual benefits and community benefits to that power, especially in the renewable space. So first, I'm going to introduce Liz Williams-Russell. She is a dear friend of CPEX, has been a long-time supporter of CPEX. In fact, later this afternoon, I hope you all join in to play the What Are You Gonna Do game, which was created by CPEX and a number of partners, some partners that are gonna be on the stage, but we wouldn't have been able to do that and make that available to the public without Liz and her support through the Foundation for Louisiana. After being at FFL, she just got a great new job. She's now the state director for the Environmental Defense Fund. She leads the development and implementation of political and advocacy strategies that move to stabilize the global climate, build defense against extreme weather, and reduce exposure to air pollution and toxic chemicals. She's got a background in architecture and experience in landscape architecture and urban design. And her design and implementation proficiencies range from fabrication and construction, detailing to community engagement, ecological design, and future planning. She's just a rock star. So welcome, Liz. Come on.
Yeah. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. How are we doing? Good. Thank you, Camille, for that generous introduction. So as Camille said, I'm Liz Russell. I'm the State Director for Louisiana at Environmental Defense Fund and Environmental Defense Action Fund. I'm excited to bring this group of panelists on and excited to be able to moderate this panel today. The reality of Louisiana is that we are the tip of the spear of all of the climate crisis. Everyone in Louisiana, we are no stranger to disaster. Between Katrina, Rita, Gustav, Isaac, the BP oil spill, the 2016 floods, Laura, Delta, Ida, Zeta, every resident of Louisiana has been under a federal flood declaration, at least one, if not 4 or 5 or 6, in the last 15 years. At the same time, we still perceive ourselves to be, and in some cases are, really reliant on the fossil fuel-based economies that sort of continue to drive us into this crisis. And so acknowledging the reality of that, acknowledging the reality of the impacts of that, acknowledging the reality of generations and centuries of disproportionate action to uplift and keep down communities. All of those things intertwine in this moment, in every moment, and give us the opportunity to really address and frame a new type of work going forward. I'm honored to be able to be in this space with so many different types of decision makers, different types of individuals who are able to incorporate bits and pieces of what the work can and should look like going forward. The people in this room, in many cases, have the privilege and responsibility of existing in the world as it is and being able to dream and implement for what the world is that we're all trying to build. So with that, I want to acknowledge this is a CLE-approved session, so for those of you that's relevant, don't forget to document your paperwork. I want to appreciate the session sponsors, Lee Michaels Jewelers, and I want to provide a little bit of an introduction to the 3 panelists who are going to come out and speak with me about a range of topics. First, I want to introduce Logan Burke, who's the Executive Director of the Alliance for Affordable Energy. They're a consumer advocacy organization that works on a variety of clean energy issues, advocating for energy efficiency programs, distributed energy, equitable and affordable access to renewables, what does long-range transmission planning look like, a sort of wide range of activities that also integrate with other activities Logan has really been pivotal in supporting in terms of housing, health, good governance, climate resilience. What do all those things mean as it intersects with Louisiana's power sector and where Louisiana's power sector sits in a broader national reality. Logan will bring to the summit incredible knowledge about Louisiana's energy policy, our sustainability, and how we move towards climate justice. Andinnovations Morris is the Executive Director of Housing NOLA, which is a 10-year partnership between the Greater New Orleans Housing Alliance, the Foundation for Louisiana, the City of New Orleans Housing and Community Development Entity, and dozens of other private, public, and nonprofit organizations, really working to solve New Orleans' affordable housing crisis. But I will say, I'm glad to see Andinnovations continuing to scale that work in many other communities across the state, and you'll want to follow up with her thereafter. She has assisted in creating opportunities for more than 500 families to become first-time homeowners after Katrina, and continues to grow and integrate that work in lots of other ways after each disaster that has followed. Rob Verchek is a professor of law at Loyola University in New Orleans. Rob is a leading climate law scholar who designed and implemented climate resilience policies in the Obama administration. He holds the Gautier St. Martin Chair in Environmental Law at Loyola University, is a senior fellow at the Disaster Resilience, in Disaster Resilience at Tulane University, and serves as president of the Center for Progressive Reform. Verchek is the author of 4 books, including a new one that just came out. I think it's called The Octopus in the Parking Garage, and host of the podcast Connect the Dots. Also a pivotal role and voice on the Governor's Climate Initiatives Task Force. So with that, I will welcome Logan Burke on stage to really set the setting and the frame for our conversation today.
Okay. Thank you for your patience. While the slide deck is getting loaded up to the larger screen, I'll just start and say how grateful I am for an opportunity to speak with people who might not think about energy every single day the way I do. And what I think is really important and what we're going to get into here is just how integral energy is to all of our lives. We've got a problem here, starting from there. Thank you. So Louisiana's energy systems are largely built around gas. I show this slide because this is an image from the federal agency that tracks all of the energy infrastructure all over the country. And you can really see, as a result of pipelines and various power plants and other liquefied natural gas terminals, that we are really built up a lot around gas. And in this case, our energy systems, I'm talking both about our power sector, where our electricity comes from, but also all of this other energy infrastructure that supports the petrochemical industry. If planning is about optimizing the use of land and resources based on a set of priorities, a framing question here is, what are we optimizing for, or what should we be optimizing for? Should it be an economic outcome for a particular set of people? Should it be about health or equity or safety? For decades, our state's economic and political systems have been organized and optimized for gas and oil industries to thrive. But the needs of Louisianans and the impacts of climate change require that we optimize for efficiency, resilience, and affordability. We need to optimize for people. So if you live in Louisiana, frankly, if you live in the world this year, you know that energy costs are rising. The image that you can see here shows the extreme changes in the cost of power over the last year. The bars, I'm not asking you to read the little numbers, but the bars that go on out there in the light blue and light green are how much are showing us how much we're paying this year for electricity, as opposed to the darker bars, which are from last year, the same time. This really impacts an awful lot of people who are already struggling to keep their lights on. In 2021, over 150,000 Louisiana households spent upwards of 23% of their income on just their home energy bills. But this is an issue that touches everyone, and no one is enjoying the status quo of the current system, which is unaffordable, inefficient, and unreliable. But why? Part of it is to do with how inefficient our use of that energy is. We aren't optimizing to save energy. Like land use planning, energy efficiency is also about optimization. The very intention of efficiency is to get the most out of the resource. So most of us are familiar, for example, with an LED light bulb that uses energy more efficiently than an incandescent one. But in Louisiana, our efficiency issues are much deeper than that, and really have to do with our housing, which simply doesn't use energy optimally. And this is a dangerous reality. This drives further unaffordability and riskier situations due to a warming climate. Efficiency is crucial to both affordability and resilience. So, for example, you can see by this chart here, already since 1979, there are 24 more days of extreme heat in Louisiana, or just in New Orleans. And so this is making us all more vulnerable. As Xero said at the beginning,
extreme heat is the #1 weather-related killer in our country. And so it's only going to be exacerbated if we don't address our housing stock, which is charming, but in most of our population centers is old and particularly leaky. And Louisiana conservation building codes have been stuck in the year 2009, and we didn't even have them until 2006, meaning much of our housing stock was built before you were required to have insulation in your home. And unfortunately, unlike in most states, Louisiana regulators haven't finalized efficiency programs. This is really important because these efficiency programs that are provided sort of statewide are the kinds of tools that have helped other states, including our neighbors just to the north in Arkansas, significantly reduce both energy bills, but also improve health and comfort in people's homes. The good news is, here in Louisiana this last year, the legislature has said it's time to update our building codes and start to address this. It was part of the governor's climate initiative's task force action list. And in addition, there's a huge pile of federal money that's coming down to help improve that energy efficiency, which should help those Louisianans that need that help most. What I want to get at here is just how unreliable and also how not resilient our energy systems are. You can see here the blue bar is what we refer to as the System Average Interruption Duration Index. That just means how long your light's out every year on an average. And obviously, from the chart, you can see just how bad Louisiana is as compared with the US average. And this is actually without storms. So I'm not even talking about the weeks-long outages or even days-long outages when there are major named storms. This chart doesn't take that into account. If you do take it into account, we are so far beyond the national average, they had to add extra lines to the chart. So coming back to what is driving a lot of this. Here in Louisiana, a significant portion, the great bulk of our electricity comes from gas. This is a chart or a map that can show you exactly where our power generation is coming from. And 71% of it is gas. This means we have a high risk factor when it comes to the volatility of the cost of gas, which I'm going to get to in a second. But it also comes down to a risk due to centralization. You can imagine when Hurricane Ida swept through, what happens to the river parishes and all of the parishes that surround those river parishes that depend on the power plants that are centralized in that area. And what does that mean in terms of the rest of our reliability and resilience in the face of storms? This points to a need to decentralize how our power is generated. And then I just want to talk for a moment about that vulnerability to international commodities markets. You may be aware that Louisiana is in planning for about 12 liquefied natural gas terminals. That is driving the significant increase in the cost of natural gas, but it in turn is driving the significant increase in the cost of your electricity bill. The more integrated we become in that international commodity market, the more vulnerable we are to those swings that we've experienced this year. But here's the potential. This is a map that shows us all of the things that could be built that are actually in development right now in the power sector in Louisiana, and only 2 of them are gas plants. 99% of it is solar, wind, and energy storage. Those are clean technologies. And if you notice, this development is much more decentralized. It's spread out, it's fuel-free, and it reduces many of those vulnerabilities that I was talking about before. The other thing that's important here is that since 2009, which is the last time the Louisiana Public Service Commission considered transitioning to renewable energy as a requirement, the cost of onshore wind has fallen by 72% and the cost of solar by 90%, which means we are paying for that vulnerability, and we're losing by not having the fuel-free resources that some of the states that are even surrounding us have that are mitigating those fuels cost swings. But we shouldn't just assume that the trade-out from the old style to the new style should just be at the large utility scale. That decentralization should also move the resources to where people are. This is one of the things after Hurricanes Laura and Ida that we saw a significant upswing in people's interest in distributed solar and storage. That just means solar on your rooftop and a battery in your backyard. These are the kinds of things that can keep people safe and healthy in their homes, even as the larger grid is undergoing a turmoil. Let's see. There we go. So some policies that are driving this future and the things that you all might pay attention to when it comes to how do we get from where we are to where we need to be. A lot of it is down to land use and zoning policies, and I'm not going to steal somebody's thunder who's going to talk in a little bit later about solar land use ordinances, but it really comes down to very often the decisions that are made right in your own parishes and municipalities. But it's also due to statewide integrated resource planning. This is just simply how do utilities plan to provide the resources that their customers need for the next 20 years? And are we going to require a transition to the kinds of renewable resources that we know we need? We also know that in order to move that power, and in order to do it both reliably and affordably, we need significant transmission upgrades. Transmission is just those big lines and towers that move high voltage power traditionally from a centralized power plant to your homes and businesses. But in a decentralized world, and with more renewable resources, we need that long-range transmission planning that really takes into account a different kind of system, and from our perspective, centers people and where they are in order to maintain health and safety. But then, of course, there are all these huge federal actions that are plowing lots of money into this transition, everything from grid resilience and expansion to environmental and climate justice block grants. These are the kinds of things that will drive communities' abilities to choose for themselves what affordability and resilience looks like. People know what they need in their communities. These federal resources are going to help them move that forward and center their needs. And then the agencies driving those policies. Obviously, I mentioned your local permitting offices. Here in Louisiana, an incredibly important one is the Louisiana Public Service Commission, which is an agency that has plenary authority and makes all of the decisions about our power sector. This is unusual in the sort of scope of US regulation, where in most states, legislatures and governors have something to say about it. So here in Louisiana, it's all down to these public service commissioners, 5 individuals who are elected to make decisions about where our power comes from and how much it costs. And I would encourage us all to know a lot more about those 5 elected individuals. And then the last thing that I would say is obviously the federal administration, the federal government has been moving toward a more whole of government view of this climate transition, not just in terms of why do we need to move to resources that mitigate the impacts of climate, but also how do we do it in a way that centers the people who've been left behind by the traditional energy economies. All of these questions are being asked and are required to be asked now by everything from the Federal Energy Regulatory Office and the Department of Energy and all of the various agencies that are going to be pushing out billions of dollars in the coming years to address our energy needs. The thing that I know that we're going to talk a lot about this in just a moment, and just to wrap up, from our perspective, we really need to solve for people and people's needs and make decisions based on the input from those communities that we're trying to solve for. It doesn't help a community at all if we are telling them what they need, because they know exactly what it is. And so it's been incredibly exciting to watch in the last couple of years following the major storms of 2020 and 2021, that communities have more of the access to the kinds of resources that they know they're looking for, and that they can basically claim their own power. All right, I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to invite our panel on out so that we can get moving on our conversation. Yeah, hopefully.
Well, thank you, Logan, for laying out all of those incredible details about the reality of our grid and our place in the global economy with our grid. I want to look to Andinnovations and Rob first, and just see if y'all have any initial reactions or quick takeaways, things that y'all want to highlight. A minute or two. No.
Good morning, everyone. Ooh, okay, let's pull that back. Good morning. So, yeah, I want to say thank you again to CPEX for having us here today and having this conversation. Again today, a lot of you know that here at Housing NOLA and the work across the state, we say put housing first, because we think that addressing housing, which has gone unaddressed because of the intersection of racial and gender stereotypes and biases that are as American as apple pie, unfortunately, lead to us not being able to address larger crises like climate change. And that's hard for people to hear, because we don't say put housing only, we say put housing first, so you can do this other stuff. And the presentation that you all just heard, Logan did a fantastic job talking about the issues and then also lifting up the housing piece, because all too often that doesn't happen. We can talk about disaster, climate intensified hurricanes, and talk about displacement and not mention housing. I once listened to a certain public official who shall remain nameless give a speech about the 2016 floods and the need to address the issues, and never once say any version of iteration of housing or home. I was really confused about how they managed to do that, but they do. And so it's the first step. And it's also one of the biggest problems. It's part of the reason we can't often get people engaged at the issues, because their lives are literally on fire inside of their homes. Very literally sometimes, or there's a hole in the roof, or again, that utility bill that comes every month is a body blow to those families. Logan talked about the number of families, the number of households that are energy cost burdened to the tune of plus 20%. But there are 640,000 households across Louisiana that exceed the traditional energy cost burden level of 8%. 640,000 households, that's homeowners and renters. Those are homes that could be made net zero today. And that's one of the other important things about this. While we must move forward and explore the technologies and develop the technologies in order to address climate change, we have the building technology today. We didn't have that 10 years ago. We didn't know how to make a home net zero 10 years ago, or at least we didn't have the right framework. We do know how to do that today. And so we should be moving forward and making those investments.
I really appreciate that. And I suspect that we're going to be talking a bit more about weatherization and pre-weatherization and using energy in homes efficiently and what that means.
We got to do it, though, not just talk about it.
I know, right? And we got to do it. We got to fund it. Rob.
Thanks a lot, and thanks for having me, everyone. This is a wonderful event. I was taken, Logan, by your point about optimizing for people and optimizing for communities, and I think that's a great idea. The one thing I want to point out is it's a really old idea. We have electric utilities all over the United States, and they're all regulated monopolies, and that's a framework that we had well over 100 years ago. And the idea behind a regulated monopoly is that in exchange for getting the exclusive use of territory for a market, utilities accept the obligation to promote the public welfare. I teach energy law, that's a legal concept. And so the idea that our electric grid and that utilities are serving the public interest is not just a fanciful aspirational thing. It's the law, and it's an economic exchange that these companies made, as I said, over 100 years ago. So that hasn't changed, right? And so the idea of pursuing the public welfare is essentially making electricity affordable, accessible, and reliable. What has changed in our century is that we're adding more things to the public welfare. We're adding more that we want, right? One thing we want is long-term resiliency in the face of climate disaster. And then another thing we want now is green energy, right? Clean energy. And the good news is that green energy, the more we expand that, the more we get help on all the other things. Because as we'll find out a little bit later, as we have more green energy, we're also going to have more affordability, more geographic accessibility, more reliability, and more resilience in the face of climate impacts.
So, Logan, you really laid the foundation for us by talking through sort of how our systems are currently optimized, how they're centered, what we have and do prioritize. I want to turn to the group and ask all of you, if we could talk a little bit more about what does it look like to optimize our systems for people? Logan's charge. What does it look like to optimize our systems for communities?
Do you mind if I jump in?
Mm-hmm. Please.
Okay, since I throw it out there to begin with. So I'm going to give you just another little fact that I didn't before. Here in Louisiana, more than half of our power is used by industry. That means more than half of our power sector is built for industry. That's very unusual. In the rest of the country, it's usually a third industry, a third commercial, a third resident. What this turns into is then when there are major storm events, so for example, hurricane or winter storm Uri a couple of years ago, when you may remember there were outages on Mardi Gras Day, and Texas was having its whole other situation. One of the knee-jerk reactions to that storm was, we need to winterize the power plants. And I thought, okay, but let's think about also what was driving the need for all that power. The fact that homes weren't winterized. And so one of the things is always thinking, rather than how do we first think about the utility system, what is the goal? The goal of the system is to serve people in their homes and in their businesses. So let's start there. Let's winterize the homes first. Let's come up with ways to keep people safe if the power goes out, because we know, because of supercharged storms, the power will go out. The more ready every home is for those impacts, the more able we are to move forward and rebuild after. And so I would just say every time there's a situation where there's a strong impact, the question needs to start with, what is the goal, what is the thing that people need in their homes to stay safe and healthy, starting there.
I would say that in thinking about optimizing communities, we think a lot about fairness and making the promises of the green transition, making those promises available to everybody, right? And so an easy example that you might be able to think about is electric cars, right, which right now are not as affordable as they could be, and those charging stations are not in all the neighborhoods in your city, and that's going to keep certain people from experiencing the promise of these electric vehicles, and the promise is more reliability, lower maintenance costs, all those kinds of things. Another promise of green transition is that you're going to have less conventional types of pollution, because if you have power plants that aren't burning natural gas, you're not going to have the soot, you're not going to have the ozone, those kinds of things coming out. But if we're talking about communities that are near fossil fuel burning power plants that are instead burying their carbon underground but continue to be putting out all the other bad stuff, then those communities aren't benefiting from the promise of a green transition. Same with electrification, right? You know, not everybody can afford the induction stove and those kinds of things that are going to actually be good, not just for people living in particular homes, but are going to be good for the community as a whole. So we need to think about how we make sure that people can share in all of the benefits, which includes, incidentally, jobs, because there are going to be a ton of jobs coming out of the expansion of green energy. And we want to make sure that everybody has the ability to take part in that new burst in the economy, or burst, boost, let's say, of the economy.
So I would also think that it's important to, again, look at the impact, look at the needs of community, but we also have to look at the loss. These opportunities present themselves. We've been talking about this for the last day and a half, the funding opportunities that are available, as you alluded to, Liz, that there's going to be billions of dollars available, and we mentioned this yesterday. We've already had billions of dollars in what's seemingly like a once-in-a-lifetime, once-in-a-generation investment here in Louisiana. We've had that, unfortunately, several times over the last 20 years because this is ground zero for the fight. And what's not happening is we're not looking at the loss to people. We talk about the loss of property and the loss of economy, but we don't talk about the loss of people, and we don't build back. We don't invest to prevent that loss of life, the displacement of people. Instead, we think if we're going to build a better mousetrap, somehow Louisianians will be trapped. And I was struck by the poet Skidmore this morning, Chancellor Skidmore, when he mentioned, he kind of framed this about heat being the largest segment of deaths when it comes to weather-related deaths. And we know that too. And we saw it as recently as last year with Hurricane Ida, where more people died after the storm for heat-related or power-related issues than they did in the storm in Louisiana. And so are we looking to rebuild to prevent that from happening? The people are. And the people are making not great decisions, but they're fighting for their lives. I told Logan, I said, you got 6 months to help me stop my family from putting natural gas generators or propane power generators out in Edgar, Louisiana. We've missed that window, and the contractors are coming because I can't stop them because we don't have another alternative. We don't have an alternative that we can access, that everybody can put their hands on and get. Because that's what folks are looking at, is that people not dying in their own homes after the worst has happened. After the worst has happened. And so we've got to be, and what we keep doing is we keep expecting these folks to be resilient. We've got to start making these communities resilient. We've got to start making these systems resilient. We've got to start making the investments resilient and centering the needs of people. And we're still not quite there yet. Our elected officials, the policymakers, and again, it's why it's important to have this conversation in this space, because you all are policymakers. You work in policy shops. I said this yesterday, y'all have got to learn to listen. And you've got to learn to offer suggestions up and out that will center, that will ensure that people do not die in their own homes after a hurricane has passed. That's where we've got to start. That's got to be the point and the answer.
I think that tone of investing in people and investing in those places that our people call home has to be core to every response and every foresight that we are trying to plan around for this climate crisis. So to sort of build on that, Louisiana, whether we like it or not, is at the forefront of every bit of this climate reality. And when I say forefront, we are at the bleeding edge of all of it. whether we want to be or not, both in terms of climate disaster and repeated events, but also in terms of our reliance on things that are global market forces and commodity prices and the fluctuations that then impact the people of Louisiana, impact job access because we are so tied to those things. You know, what challenges does the reality of being on that bleeding edge bring? Obviously, we talk about that a lot, but also what opportunities? What can we take advantage of if we can gear ourselves around the understanding that we're here whether we like it or not? We are at the intersection of what to do about the climate crisis and how to react to it. There is no other place in the country that is both on both sides of that coin in the way Louisiana is. So what challenges, what opportunities, where do you see our constituency and our public will for action in that context?
So I'll go first on this one. The opportunity is the biggest opportunity I see is a double-edged sword, is that because smart people from across the globe see this, have looked at these numbers. We've heard this over the last day and a half. This is where the fight is. We've seen those numbers. We've seen how Louisiana outpaces so many other communities when it comes to these issues. So people see that and then they want to help. And that's a double-edged sword because they want to come and help. And we've got to also talk about race. We've got to also talk about equity, and we've also got to talk about power. So smart people wanting to come to Louisiana to help should not be a bad thing, but it often is, because they don't understand the systems that are here. They don't understand. There is a presumption that the reason we're stuck here is because we're stupid, because we're too dumb to get out of our own way. And our elected officials and some of our policymakers help reinforce that, right? I'm not gonna pretend that we haven't been embarrassing ourselves on the national stage for quite some time. The people we send to other places to represent us. But so they come with that notion, well, they elected that clown, so they must be dumb. Right? I mean, I get it, but we still got to deal with wow, you really understand this. Damn, you're so smart.
So where do you see our constituency? Where do you see our constituency, right?
Our constituency.
Where are the residents of Louisiana?
They are ready. They are ready. They are ready. I talked about this. I talked to the group yesterday a little bit about the poll that we did that showed that the people of Louisiana are ready to rock and roll. So they know about that. We saw a poll the other day that said some similar data. So the people of Louisiana need leadership. They need folks who are ready to hear them, center their needs, not simply show off for funders or philanthropy, or show off for press, national press, or show off for other advocates who don't live here, right? On the national or world stage. People who come here to help can't come here to do anything but serve the people of Louisiana, not show off in other places across the planet. That's not gonna work. Mm-hmm. You will get embarrassed and sent home.
Logan, Rob?
I work with young adults every day, and I'll tell you what, they are supercharged and they're ready. I gave a talk a few weeks ago about the Public Service Commission and mentioned the elections that were coming up and how important those were. And I had a row of students afterwards asking me about how to get involved in that. So anyway, I got a challenge and I got an opportunity, okay? So the challenge nationally and here too is this perceived tension, I think, between speed and fairness or planning, all right? And we're seeing it already. I mean, we've been dithering so much on infrastructure, for years and years, talking about infrastructure, not doing anything about it. So we finally have done something about it. We finally got money coming in. And everybody says, oh, we got 10 years to do it because of climate change and so on and so forth. So let's suspend all of our environmental reviews and public participation and these kinds of things.
That's right.
Now, Senator Manchin actually is trying to get this into a defense bill actually coming up to to remove, some of the public participation in environmental reviews for putting in pipelines and other kinds of things. Now, those things do slow processes down. I'm not going to argue that they don't, but I think that they can work in a way that makes things much more efficient, because you want to measure twice and cut once, or as the nuns in my school when I was growing up used to say, haste makes waste, right? I mean, so you want to make sure if you're burying stuff under the wetlands or whatever that it makes sense to do, right? And you're just not doing it rapidly, because you can't undo those problems once you create them. So that's the challenge, I think, is to keep the eye on where we want to be, but at the same time, plan, right? The second thing, which I think is a huge opportunity, is what's going on with the sale of leases for offshore wind. We just had another sale of leases on the West Coast. We've opened up, or rather the administration has opened up 2 different areas for leases of offshore wind in the Gulf. A lot of people don't know this, but so much of the building of those offshore platforms around the world and on the Atlantic coast, that's masterminded here in Louisiana. The largest offshore farm we have right now off the coast of Rhode Island, the jackets, the leggings for those platforms, built here. The blades for those turbines, built here in New Orleans East. The lift boats that put those things together, built here. And the reason is, over almost 100 years, whatever, we in this state showed the world how to implement offshore oil drilling. And because of that long, and I would argue proud tradition, we are in the situation that we can show the world how to build offshore wind in all kinds of places, planting it in the undersea beds, floating it, putting it in front of hurricanes or cyclones, because Asia has the same issues, and there are ways to build those things and organize them, and there are a huge number of jobs and assets available in this state. I mean, we've got mothballed lift boats that aren't doing what they could be doing because we've lost oil and gas jobs. So all of this can come back in a modern, good way. And I just think that's an enormous opportunity that we cannot waste. That cannot go to Houston. It's got to be here and homegrown.
You took one of my opportunities.
There are
It's okay, I've got more. I've got lots more.
There
I've got lots more.
There are more.
So the opportunity that I want to note, after Hurricane Ida, all of a sudden, the stuff that the organization that I run, that we've been talking about for a few years now, which is distributed solar and storage, that nobody really was ready for, nobody knew about, all of a sudden my phone was blowing up. And not necessarily from people from the outside saying, we want to send you this stuff, but from people in community who saw that it worked on somebody's rooftop in their neighborhood and said, we need to make that happen everywhere. And what's interesting is that it's happening really from a grassroots level. Organizations are trying to figure out not just how do we make, the community center or the church resilient and ready to move food to communities, but also how can we make sure our businesses, like our restaurants, which are, I would argue, they're just as important culturally as they are from a business perspective in Louisiana. How can they be part of this solution? And it's incredible to watch that Louisianans from all political perspectives seem to be really ready and wanting to move on this. And it's kind of cool that now I'm getting phone calls from advocates in places like Arizona and Michigan saying, you guys, Louisiana's really moving fast on figuring out how to make all of this happen, these resilient hubs. And they said, how did you, who were the decision makers that made that happen? And I'm like, well, that's the community, man. And that is, I think, exactly what Andronika is talking about, which is listen to what it is that people say they want and follow that need. And so it's exciting, I think, that Louisiana, again, because we are dealing with the impacts first and worst, we have had to figure out how to solve for that. And so we have an opportunity to lead on that, and it's already happening. I think the greatest challenge is not that people in Louisiana aren't ready for a more affordable, reliable, and climate-ready, resilient grid. I think there's a worry that Louisiana is too entrenched in something else that we can't change. And what we know is that if you just talk to people, they're ready, and they say, but my neighbor's not ready, or my politician who I voted for is not ready. And I really think we've got to get past that and say, okay, but if you're ready and I'm ready and they're ready, well then we're ready. And we just need to move. And so that's our challenge we got to get over.
Yeah, I think that was one of my favorite parts of that particular polling data underneath it that you showed us, right? Everybody thinks that their neighbor's not ready, but they're not ready, right? But everybody's saying that same thing, and I thought that was really fascinating. So to drive on that previous question, right? Logan, you mentioned the drastic price reductions in onshore wind and in solar, right? 72% in onshore wind and 90% price reduction in solar. It is so apparent that global market forces are already, a transition is coming, right? The train is moving, it has left the station. We can either watch it go by or and deal with the impacts, or we can get on board and figure out how to play a role and what is that role. So I guess, how do we engage in the front end and sort of the near term to leverage those opportunities that we've mentioned to get ahead of the impacts that a global energy transition will have on our state or could have on our state? How do we get ahead of those things, mitigate them, take advantage of them? I'd love to hear thoughts.
I'd love to jump in really quickly and say, what we cannot do is say that we're going to be the last people selling everybody oil and gas. I'm sorry. We can't be the last sacrifice zone. That's what we are, that is what is our trajectory right now, because everywhere else they're saying, well, we don't want to frack, we don't want to do these things, we don't want to build liquefied natural gas terminals. And I'm not saying just everywhere else in the country, which is also true. I'm saying also everywhere else in the world. And so what I'm saying is that the Gulf Coast cannot be the last place that is throwing all of our weight behind this one industry or this one sort of suite of industries, because then when we kind of look up and realize that this transition has happened internationally, and well, what have we done for ourselves? And so I think, while I want to be abundantly clear, none of this transition happens overnight, and no one is asking for it to happen tomorrow. No one is saying that that is a smart way to do it. But we have to start now, and we can't just wait until we've tapped our last well.
Oh, I'll say one thing about, I think, all this money coming in, which is super impressive, right? We're going to, I mean, tens of billions of dollars through both of the legislative packages from the Biden administration. One of the things that I worry about, and I think about my days at EPA when I was in the Obama administration, is a lot of these grants that are going to be coming in are competitive, which means that you need to have communities who are ready, who are savvy, who are sophisticated and well-resourced to make a really compelling case for how to spend the government's money. And you would want it that way, right? You would want to know that your taxpayer money is being spent in the best way possible for the most benefit. The problem, the tension with that, is that a lot of communities that could use it the most don't have the resources to build those grants and those proposals. I was talking to a friend of mine at EPA just the other day about lots of money coming in the Office of Water for EPA, which goes to retrofit and expand sewage treatment plants and all the pipes with the lead and all of that kind of thing, right? She says, we've got lots of money, and we're being told by the administration, right, that 40% of the benefits, this is true, it's called Justice 40, 40% of the benefits the Biden administration assures us are going to go to disadvantaged communities, which is a wonderful thing. But how do you get those communities in the competitions, right? And so there is a lot of movement. The White House is doing a lot of good work trying to promote that and trying to make things easier, try to put in technical assistance for communities that want to do that. Here in Louisiana, I've been on the task force, the Climate Change Initiative Task Force, been involved in a number of conversations, as many of us have, about how we prepare our communities in Louisiana for this, because we're competing against all the rest of the country, right? And so we have to get together, and that's one of the reasons why we can't say, oh, well, let's think about whether the transition's good for us or not. In 2 years, we're told globally, renewables will be the largest source of electricity on the planet. It's going to eclipse coal in just 2 years, and so we've got to be on that electric train.
Right. So both Rob and Logan, I think, set up really well my comments, because this is the conundrum, right? For us, specifically for Louisiana, is we're being told there's an opportunity. We see the opportunity. These are opportunities we have unfortunately failed to seize in the past. So our history tells us that we are not going to be good at this. We can't be successful at it. And that fatalism is our downfall, right? And also it lets our elected officials, and I cannot say this enough, it lets them off the hook. Because the folks who failed before, they're the ones who failed before. Their lack of imagination, their corruption, their weakness failed us before. The disaster profiteers, both local and national, show up and say, we know how to do this. You don't know how to do it. You absolutely do not know how to do this and serve community. We know that. Louisiana knows that. After Hurricane Katrina, the state of Louisiana did one of the most extraordinary things ever in firing a multi-billion-dollar contractor that was managing the Road Home program. You know how hard it is, how bad you have to be at something for the state of Louisiana to fire you? But they still managed to waltz away with $900 million of our money. And that contractor is working now in Puerto Rico and working in Texas to help those communities recover. So the federal government is now doing the things that we've been screaming at them to do for the last 17 years, which is, you all have to put some guardrails on this money. You have to stop flooding communities with disaster relief with no data other than they've used some of the FEMA data pretty well, but with no guardrails, because what state and local governments insist on doing is blaming the federal government, the federal regulations for their failures. Well, we had to negotiate with HUD, we had to negotiate with DOE, we had to negotiate with FEMA, and that's how we ended up with a program that screwed you. And now the federal government is putting on those guardrails. They are setting priorities. They are saying 40% of this money needs to go to people who you missed the last time you had a catastrophe. So are we ready to say to our state and local leaders, okay, don't call your cousins, nephews, brother-in-law, who wants to start a company to, build houses that are net zero, and they don't know what they're talking about. Don't do that. Do not do that. There are people who know how to do this. There are people who want to learn how to do it. They are local, and let's keep this money local. Are we going to hold them accountable, or are we going to let them, because they're doing it now. We're in the midst of, right now, having the conversation to update our energy code. Logan talked about that, so that our energy conservation codes, or our building codes, will actually be modern and reflective of what we need to make sure our homes and our buildings are energy efficient. And we have public officials, I'm sitting on the committee, we have public officials today in the last 30 days, we had a conversation where a public official said out loud in a meeting, well, you know, FEMA won't let us build the houses nicer. That's a bald-faced lie, right? That's just not true. So but they're already setting up the narrative to why they're going to fail, to why they can't do what we require. We have to push back on that. We have to be ready to look at this. And I will say, Rob, one thing, one pushback on you. The project, the community, well, only one. Community engagement does not slow down the dispersal of federal money. I've done this my entire career. It's a slow process, an incredibly slow process. You could spend 6 months talking to community and get the plan just right, and it will not slow down the dispersal of those dollars by one day. Because it's already a really, really, really slow process. Already. So don't say that. But everything else you said was right.
Thanks for that. I feel like there's also something to really drive at there, right? In terms of these resources that are available and how do we actually prioritize them getting out on the ground to the people who need them most? What does it look like as a state to invest in grant writers for the communities that have seen decades and generations of marginalization and lack of access to resources and seen layers upon layers of underinvestment and disinvestment? How do we start there as the place to drive those resources first? How do we start there as a place to connect community colleges, workforce development, small business grants, all of the things on and on? Take advantage of those opportunities with orphaned well money, methane mitigation money, renewables rent money, right? It's all coming. How do we make sure Louisiana people are first and foremost centered in all of those opportunities? So that brings me a little bit to the sort of data landscape and all of the information that comes along with these opportunities. Many of the people in this room have the privilege, responsibility, maybe even the burden sometimes, of integrating all of these types of information in opportunities, as well as things like future land loss, where communities have seen disinvestment, changing types of projections on impacts or migration or inclusive economies. What does that look like? What does it look like to also do long-term planning in that context? For Logan, as you discussed, distributed generation or pre-weatherization investments of our aged, but what did you call it? Charming, Logan? Aged but charming housing stock.
Yeah.
How do we actually include those other things that have come up? And how should we navigate the tensions between what are the different proposed highest and best uses of our available land and real estate?
Well, let me say something about the planning part, and I'm going to take it on maybe on a larger scale. One of the things I do is I research and write a lot about climate resilience, and I've been doing that in the United States and recently was in Australia working with the Australian government on a resilient grid. And one of the things that I found out surprised me that there's nowhere in the world that has a standard for what a resilient grid is supposed to look like. We're good at reliability, which is the short-term part, but we actually don't even have an agreement on what resilience looks like. And so the first thing we need is a standard, right, or at least a definition. And FERC, which is in our country, that's the Energy Regulatory Commission, for the very first time just this year, proposed a rule that would require the development of a standard for long-term resilience on the power grid, at least for extreme heat and for extreme cold. And that's a huge thing, because then we'll actually have standards that we can begin to talk about. And after we have standards, then we can start doing assessments to actually see, are we falling behind or are we there? So that's talking about the grid in general, and I know that we can talk about homes and buildings and the rest, but one of the things I have seen in my research is we don't even have the concept defined yet of what we want. And that's really, really important, and that's something that planners can help us with.
I just want to continue saying one of the things that Rob has just said about the lack of definition. an agreed definition around resilience. I think we're all familiar, we're all in spaces where 10 years ago the word was sustainability. And that was the word that nobody could kind of agree on, but that everybody was driving toward. I think because things are changing so rapidly, and we can all agree that the ground is sort of shifting under us, I think when it comes to settling on some language, yes, we have to agree. We've got to come up with what resilience means to the power grid versus housing versus food systems, all of the things. But I'm going to say what I said standing over there. It has to be about how do we protect life, health, and safety. I think so often when we think about resilience, it's like, how do we keep the bridge standing up? Okay, but how do we keep the people cared for that use the bridge? To me, it's always about coming back and saying, what is the purpose of the thing for our benefit, for the public interest? And so, but also recognizing that, as Rob said earlier, how we define the public interest has shifted in the last 100 years since we said that's the standard. Recognizing also that because so much is shifting due to climate change and economic change and political change, that may continue to shift what we think of as in the public interest. And I would argue that that resilience, or I actually like to use the word adaptability, needs to be fundamental to the public interest going forward.
So I would say to Liz's question about the data, we don't often have all the data we need to make these decisions and to conduct this analysis. Again, I'm going to come back to the housing point. Most communities don't spend a lot of time talking about housing the way that we need to, right? Not really. How many of you know what's the cost burden rate in your communities, right? The number of people who are either energy cost burden or housing cost burden in your communities. How many people struggle with that? I see a couple hands coming up, right? How many of you know, other than what you heard on the news, what it actually costs to build a house, right? Not what you heard on the news about how high it is, but what it actually costs. Not what you heard about inflation and rising wages and insurance. Well, how many of you actually know that, right? And understand it? How many of you know how many blighted houses you have and their conditions and what it will take to actually, what investment is necessary? We have that information in New Orleans. That's what we do every day, and we're helping our community partners across the state conduct similar analysis, but most people aren't looking at that. So as Liz started to talk about with weatherization, you put out a weatherization program from the federal government and say, hey, we're gonna help you get from baseline to a place where your house is optimized, where your house is actually winterized or actually protected when the next storm comes through. But the house got a hole in the roof and it doesn't have floors. So where's that money going to come? How many, that, oh my God, there are thousands of people in our community can take advantage of that, who need that. But you missed the first part. There's not thousands of people who can take advantage of it. The number of people who can actually take advantage of that program today is much less than the people who need it because of the condition, the underlying condition of your housing stock. So you've got to start getting ready you got to start having all of those conversations. And that's something that you all can do in your middle management role. I know how planners struggle, right? With not being heard by the elected officials and the senior policymakers you work with, and community is struggling. So it's difficult for you to get out there. But if you come with information that helps clarify why this program, which is desperately needed, won't quite work.
May I say just one really quick thing is, one of the reasons so much doesn't happen, and we know this through surveys, is people say we don't have the right information and there's too much uncertainty and we don't know what climate projections are going to look like or what precipitation patterns. If you're interested in that kind of thing, Georgetown Climate Center has a wonderful website that has lots of information for municipal planners in particular, and transportation planners, all on, first of all, wonderful case studies all over the country, and then second of all kinds of data that can be used in local ways. So Georgetown Climate Center, and then also the EPA itself has a wonderful climate adaptation website that looks at case studies and provides information. And you can just Google either one of those things and you'll get a lot of information.
Thanks so much for adding that resource, Rob.
Sorry?
I said thank you for adding that resource. Yeah, absolutely. Definitely want to underscore that. So it feels like we're talking a lot about the different bits of conversations, right? And it's striking me that one of the pivotal things where each of you are bringing up these realizations, so much of this, for Logan, you keep driving the point of like, if we're not thinking about people, what are we doing? And I guess in that, it is so apparent that we also have to be ensuring that the design and decision-making tables that have to account for how we respond to disaster and adapt to the changing circumstances, all of which you mentioned, Logan, as well as reducing our emissions and mitigating the sort of climate reality therein. All of those things also come down to who sets the design and decision-making tables. How do they get brought together? Do we make time in that long, lengthy process to advocate for money through our different faux grant makers, grant writers that are seeking it? Do we make the time to have that capacity? So I guess with all of that in mind, I want to look to the room. What is the role of each of us? How do we each in this room think about our unique set of things that we can offer? There's a reality in Louisiana that all of us could work all day, every day, for the rest of our lives, no breaks, and we still wouldn't have solved for everything that we're all working on. There's enough room for everybody to work forever. We do not need to compete over the same territory, something we tend to struggle with. But what is the role? What is your call to action for the people in this room?
Oh, go ahead. So it is, for me, it's really simple. I've been talking about it all morning. It's listening, right? And not just, we talked about this yesterday, not just listening. What happens after you've heard what community wants? That's the next part, right? How do you act? How do you advocate? And this is a challenge that we as a society really have to grapple with, because I've realized over the years that most people are not as comfortable with conflict as I am. And particularly interpersonal conflict. And so what happens when you've heard what community wants and you go back into your system that is not ready to make that change, right? So people start thinking, well, do I quit and I'm going to lose my job? But are there other ways that you can advocate and you can engage, right? We can talk about elections, you can talk about volunteering, you can talk about organizing, working with other communities, but inside of that space, do you have the courage after you have discerned the things that you can change and recognize that you cannot accept what the unacceptable? Do you have the courage to change? Do you have the strategy, right? It's not all about flipping over tables. That's fun. Can you figure out how to manage around to move the needle, right? Can you get the data necessary to make your case? Can you figure out what it is that your boss, that your supervisor, that your elected official, what is it that they want? And can you make that connection? Or are you going to sit there and say, they're not listening to me, I'm right, and I'm so smart, and they just not listening to me? Because that's what a lot of people do in those spaces, in their shoes, right? They're like, no one's listening to me. I know all the answers. You center yourselves. And it's a real problem, because as sympathetic as I am to the idea of smart, talented people's voices going unheeded, people are dying. And you have a chance to make an impact. You don't have the right to center yourselves in that conversation. You have to figure it out. And I get that that's hard, but that's the gig. And if you don't want that job, then quit. But that's the job. That is the job. That's it. That's all we got at this point. That's it. So there are people who will help you. All the people on this stage will help you. You want to pick up the phone and call, even surreptitiously, text, whatever. We will show up for that stuff. Let your community partners know, look, I'm stuck. I need some help. I need some cover. But you really have to understand the scenario. It can't just be about your prodigious intellect and your analysis of the situation, of the problem. You need to understand the people you have to help advocate with. And a lot of planners don't know how to do that, right? A lot of folks are keyboard warriors and they like tweeting about things that they don't like. You've got to be able to look at somebody and, like I did with Rob, and say, you're wrong.
We're still friends.
That's right, that's right. That's right.
Depends on the day, right? No. Logan, Rob?
I don't know how you follow that, because so many of us work in these spaces where, for example, as planners, you have a scope and you might not be in the advocate seat or be the seat in the driver seat or feel that you are. But just like Andronika said, you do have a role to advocate every day for the thing that you think is right. I'm not a religious person, but I am mission oriented outside of my organization. And I think, I think by saying, I care about this thing, and I'm going to continue to advocate for it, and I know that I'm right. Yeah, I know that I'm right intellectually, but what does that mean? How does that continue to help move the needle for the people that I'm trying to support? So I'm just going to stop there, because she said it better.
Amen. I was having a conversation, chatting a few days ago with a climate scientist named Katharine Hayhoe, whom some of you may know. And she's a lead author on many of the climate reports that the U.S. government does. And I told her I was coming here, and I said, what do I need to tell the planners? And she said, to learn how to listen and to talk about this issue with as many groups of people as possible. And the second thing that she said was that to stress and emphasize all of the good things that come with expanded renewables, aside from reducing carbon, which is job one, but something that we won't materially experience for a long time coming. So we need to think about how it's clean and pretty and these other kinds of things. Now, Katharine Hayhoe is a self-identified evangelical Christian as well. And she writes about that and talks about that a lot, because her point is you have to meet people where they are, find values that resonate with them, and learn to talk with all kinds of different communities. She's got a wonderful, super readable book called Saving Us, which talks just about how to do this. And I think, and I agree with Katharine that listening is the most important thing, but then talking about climate to as many people in as many situations as you can, because we are finding that people are paralyzed. They care about this issue, they don't know what to do about it, and they don't even talk about it. Even the people who are super concerned don't talk about it. because they don't know how, and they don't know how it's going to go down with people that they love and care about. And so I think that in your jobs, in your families, during the holidays, it's time to bring these issues up and talk about them in civil and loving ways.
Simple and loving. Say it with love. So I'll say, first of all, thank you to all the panelists. Thank you for your insights, for your leadership, for your ongoing commitment to your piece of the work. I want to underscore that because I want to acknowledge that, yeah, there's lots of planners in the room, there's local government officials, in this room are people who are leaders in certain spaces, in your own space. And so I just want to encourage everyone to find and dive into your piece of whatever this work is, and take it and listen to others and find ways to run with the people you can, to move slow with the people that you need to. The speed of trust is slow, and unless we are able to find ways to work together and tag team and bring together constellations of those trust and partners, it's going to be hard for us to tackle all of these things. So thank you all for your time and for your commitment to the work. I want to remind you to make sure you get your CLE paperwork, and just again, gratitude for being with us here this morning, and thank you to CPEX for being willing to hold this conversation.